Hello, everybody, and welcome to this very solemn, very maybe sad, angry. You can insert your emotion here, but it'll probably be inserted into this show. This is the Leafs Line podcast. I'm your host, Mary Russo, joined by Evan Davis and Jared Rotenberg, an Adamo Romulus episode once more. But he's busy doing big time things, so it's all that really matters. But we got kind of the news that we didn't really want to talk about, at least at this point in time. Weren't expected to talk about. The team that we're about to talk about wasn't expected to kind of crumble out like they did last week. But here we are talking about it and teeing up the probably final episode of our podcast so far this year on the Toronto Maple Leafs. It'll be a nice somber close to the 2023 season. And it was on Friday when they lost to the Florida Panthers 3-2 in overtime. Second round exit. So that's a new one for us to say in our lives. It's usually the first one there, but they won a total amount of 2 more games than they did last season. So, I mean, Jared, I'll start with you because you obviously have been the more passionate figure on our show with the Toronto Maple Leafs and when it comes to what they've been doing and how they've been performing, especially in those big moments like we've seen in the playoffs. Just what were the initial reactions when they lost? How much of it was tied to that obviously no goal call in the Morgan Riley play? And just what was going through your head after a game, a round 2 elimination, which is obviously a step forward. We haven't seen it really in our lives, at least that we remember. But again, spill all the emotions here. What was it like after that game 5? Like I believe it was. Game 5 loss.
Game 5.
Did the Panthers go on?
And it was pure just frustration. I mean, as you said, there was some reffing things, and obviously that was something I was mad about, and I've seen the clips all over my face, flooding my feed on Twitter. And don't get me wrong, there's part of me that was pissed off about that, and I was retweeting them, this is bullshit, this is whatever. But that isn't the reason I was frustrated. The reason I was frustrated is because the core, as seems to be a yearly tradition, they poop the bed. Like the big boys, I thought once they took out Tampa, they were going to be kind of over this, and they're going to be, this is our shot. Boston's eliminated. It looks like the Eastern Conference is ours to claim. And I definitely thought that was going to be our chance to go on a run. And they totally looked at a golden egg and they walked the other way. Like they totally collapsed. I don't know if it was under the pressure of it or what it was, or if it was doing the same thing Boston did and just underestimating Florida. But whatever the reason, we just straight up looked at the Florida Panthers and we totally played down. We learned how to beat a great goalie in the playoffs. We learned how to beat Vasilevsky, and we totally went back on all those lessons against Florida and against Bobrovsky. And we did what we tend to do, which is make these goalies that aren't actually that great look superhuman. We make these teams that aren't that great look unbeatable. And it's the same pattern we repetitively do. And the big boys showed up against Tampa, showed that they're capable of stealing a series. And I finally had my hopes built up that this core is capable. And they totally went right back on all the lessons I thought they had learned by just not showing up at all. None of the big boys showed up. The defense was a mess. It was just a disaster. And the reffing stuff made game 5 frustrating, but that is not by any stretch of the imagination why we lost the series. The reason we lost the series is because in game 1 to 3, we straight up played the worst playoff games that I think I could remember from this core, which, considering after they had just done the thing they haven't done in 19 years, that is not what I thought I was going to be saying the next week. I thought they finally were going to learn their lesson and play spectacular hockey to the level they were, I believed, capable of, but they just totally did the opposite.
And I mean, it truly did feel different after that first round victory. Like, I mean, I wrote a couple articles on it myself, just for a personal thing. And I mean, reading about it all over the internet and just seeing all these posts, the energy that was in Toronto, it really felt unique, something that this team could harness. Any team, any organization in the world should and could harness and take into the next round and go on a run. I just don't understand where the roadblock was. What kind of stopped? It is a star players. You're right. They did not show up. But what was that mentality that said, it kind of flipped the switch off? It was so on. They dominated that first round series. And then once they get into the second, it was completely backwards. Evan, you want to comment on the core 4, maybe in the core 5? You could include anybody in this list if you want. And like just their lack to not even just show up in the big games, but just the games in general. It's just been just a complete turn of events compared to game 1, or round 1, which makes it just that much more frustrating and that much more puzzling to solve.
Yeah, I kind of disagree with what you were saying. I don't really think the Leafs really dominated in this year's playoffs. I think the only game out of the 11 that they played in that they really dominated was game 2 against Tampa Bay.
Oh, I agree.
Other than that, like, I don't know if you guys saw my tweet, but my dad found this stat that the Leafs only led in 25% of their game. Like, they only had a lead 25% of the time. 50% of the time the game was tied. they really, I would argue that they might have been better last postseason than they were this
I would
postseason.
agree with that.
But
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
they played a way better series.
Yeah, but look, to their credit, they got the timely goals, and we would credit any team with that. The Leafs, they scored at least when it mattered the most. They got those late goals, and then they ended up winning 3 games in overtime in Tampa Bay. So that's the reason why they won the first round. But I don't know what it is. I really thought that not Sheldon Keefe, that Kyle Dubas's comments. I was like, oh my god, like I've never heard someone say, like, I've never heard these words come out of his mouth, that like no one's off the books in terms of a trade. And I think you're right at this point. Like I thought Ryan O'Reilly was phenomenal in the first round. I think he was the main reason why the Leafs got those timely goals, non-existent against Florida. Marner didn't score until game 4 against them. Like Matthews, non-existent. They were great in round 1. Matthews with, again, timely goals, but I think a big trade needs to happen uh, in order for this team to really find a new identity. And I think that's what they really need to find, is a new identity. And Kyle Dubas made it clear no one is off the table unless Matthew says he wants to re-sign. But
It sounds like he does, though. He
my
does say
only
he
thing
wants.
is, I don't think Matthews resigns if Kyle Dubas leaves. And that's only just because I don't know if he wants to wait and see what new management would be like. If Kyle Dubas stays, I think Matthews stays. If Kyle Dubas doesn't stay, I don't know if Matthews would.
Yeah, and I mean, for the offseason chat, I think I want to maybe peg that in for a little later in the show, just
For
because
sure.
there's just so much to dig into, and it all stems off of the playoff loss that we just kind of witnessed in the last 2-3 weeks. But because there's gonna be a lot of it is all tied together. There's gonna be a lot of changes pieces. That is one thing that I think is definite, regardless of who's the GM, who's the coach. There's gonna be one less player of the core, I think, involved. But we'll talk about that in a bit. I want to go back into kind of how the series unfolded with the Florida Panthers and just the players that were in a position to make a difference that did not. And you can even look on the back end too. I thought Morgan Riley, God bless his soul, he was, I think, the best Toronto Maple Leaf that we saw throughout the postseason, through and through.
Mm-hmm.
He got everything done. He was clutch. He was scoring goals, was something Riley did struggle with this season, but finally turned it. He was the only guy who turned the switch up rather than turning it up and down and flicking into your burning your light bulbs in your house. He was the guy who was steady at the wheel, and that is something you really need to see on the back, and especially from your top guy. But other than that, you're going to go look at Brody. You want to go look at McCabe. Those two pairings before they got split up, they struggled mightily. Justin Hall was, who may or may not be, probably the latter for next year. He struggled very well. I think in the Tampa Bay series, he's on for about 70-80% of their goals against. Like that's a ridiculous stat for any defenseman. Like, and Giordano, let's not forget him. He's always been the valuable piece that we've had. Maybe not money wise, but when he's standing up and he's doing what he has to do as a veteran, that's where his value is brought. He really looked like a veteran out there, and not for the right reasons. Very old, very sluggish. Jared, I'll go back to you. The back end of this Maple Leafs defense, I think that was one of the big headlining ideals of what happened in this series and how it transformed. They weren't just strong enough. They were getting beaten more often than not. That's something to fix in the offseason, which we'll talk about. But what did you notice was the biggest struggle from that defense that just couldn't find it together in the second round? And at the end of the day, it wasn't Riley and Shen who were on the ice for most of the goals. It was the guys behind them. And that was our best pairing, Riley and Shen. So how do you work through the kinks? And what did you see was wrong with the second and third pairing that just didn't let this team put into any sort of gear whatsoever?
They were just straight up slow. They were slow. They were so easy to blow by. They were so easy to beat. And no matter what pairing it was on the ice, because you're right, it was Riley and Shen that were fantastic. But both of the other pairings, take your pick about who's on the ice, they were so easy to get by, and it just made it so they couldn't shut anything down. And they made it so the front of our net was basically free real estate for whatever Florida Panther player wanted to get in on, whether it was Samsonov or Woll. Like it was so easy to get through our team, get through our net, and we didn't check them at all. We obviously stepped up our physicality, but we certainly didn't pressure them and make it hard for them to get to the front of our net. We made it way too easy on them, and that's why they were able to get those timely goals and constantly put pressure, get those open rebounds, and totally pepper our goaltenders, because there was no one in front of them who was preventing that.
Yeah, and I mean, the defense was just a massive concern, and it was like every game you can pick out plays by plays that they were just mental lapses. Laziness was the big one I found in the second round. But other than the defense, the biggest defense of all is in goal, as we know. And we had a big changing of the guard in the second round of the playoffs when Ilya Samsonov went out with injury and Joseph Woll came in. And quite honestly, I don't know if you guys share the same sentiments as I do, but I thought Joseph Woll looked a lot more calmer in net, smoother, controlled, composed. Insert your metaphor for a goalie here. He looked all that. And I think he really made a case for what's to come next year, which we'll talk about in a bit. But Evan, I'll go to you now. What did you make of the goaltending situation in Toronto and how they didn't use Matt Murray, who was kind of rumored that he could get in or not? He was still kind of dealing with the injury, but you knew he was on the bench. That means for any team, you could theoretically go in, which obviously was good enough to go into the game. Do you rate that they went with Woll? And is that something that kind of helped them kind of lock it down as a team? Because he went in during that game 4, game 4 when they got the win. So what was your take on Joseph Woll and how he inserted himself in the lineup and what he brought to this team? And is it something we can see transition into next year when I'm pretty confident he will be the backup or even maybe even a starter, depending on how the contract situations play out? But thoughts on Joseph Woll?
I thought he looked really good, like for a rookie goaltender or someone who really just gets the ins and outs of the NHL lifestyle. He looked really, really calm. And that game against Florida, giving up only one goal, that was a really, really good game. And I argue if anybody else was in net, the Leafs might have been swept. I think Joseph Woll stole that game more than the Leafs as a whole won it. I think it was really him that controlled. And you saw towards the end of the game with like 2.5 minutes left, just diving around, like just anything to get that puck out. I thought he played great. I thought he respectfully earned a game 5. I would not have put Matt Murray in that position. Not only the fact that he just hadn't played in a long time, I just think that's horrible for him, like mentally wise. Just your first game back, it's a do or die situation. You're in Toronto. You know the media is going to be after you if you lose this game. I thought it was just smart to keep Joseph Woll in there and kind of just eliminate any slander Matt Murray would have gotten if he was pumped for 4 goals and Joseph Woll came back in.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a better transition now into the offseason where we have to worry about kind of Matt Murray. We have to worry about how the goalie's contracts play out with Ilya Samsonov. Is he going to be the starter? How is that going to take shape? We'll stick to the goalie first and move our way outwards to the team. Jared, I'll throw it to you. Matt Murray, what a failed experiment from Kyle Dubas's part. I mean, we kind of knew it was a gamble and that it was more likely to fail, and it blew up right in his face as expected. He didn't make one playoff start, didn't start 1 second in the postseason, and I think that's kind of what he was brought in. He had the postseason expertise with the Penguins. He had 2 Stanley Cups. This is the guy who, if you had to put him in, he had the clutch gene and could get it done. Couldn't even get in. And it was because of the ways that was making him a risky bet, a risky trade. He was getting injured, and obviously in game, whatever it was, 78, 80, whatever, at the near the end of the season, he gets hurt, and there we go. It's the same old story. So what is your thoughts on the Dubas going out to get Matt Murray and how that kind of blew up in his face and how we transition that into next year? Is he going to be on LTIR? Is he going to even be with the team? Are they going to buy him out? And what is the starting goaltending tandem going to look like? Is it going to be more of a tandem, or is it going to be more of one guy's a starter and one guy's the backup? And it might be interesting now that Joseph Woll kind of show that in the most clutch of moments, in the biggest of moments, he can play.
I think the tandem that we saw throughout the playoffs with Woll and Samsonov, I think that is going to be our tandem for next year, because I think we saw there's no way in hell that Matt Murray is a part of this team next year, unless, as you mentioned, it is possible to just staple him right on LTIR, because that would be 4.6 or something along those lines, $1 million that we would have to work with if he is on LTIR. And if he isn't healthy enough to return next year, that is a strategy we could elect to use. But I could honestly imagine it being a little bit similar to the situation that happened last year with Peter Mrazek. I could see us stapling that first round pick that we got in the Sandin trade to move down a couple spots in the draft and get a team to basically take Matt Murray off our hands. And I was a big fan of, in theory, the idea of Matt Murray, the fact that he comes to Toronto with these 2 first-round picks. And I said, he never, you can't take that off his resume. So I definitely, there's a part of me, I'll admit, that was excited when we got Matt Murray and whatever. So I don't hate the gamble Dubas made. And even in the games we saw early in the season from Matt Murray, obviously he was injured in game 1. But once he came back, he definitely had a few games where he totally stole things. He stepped up in overtimes and whatever. And I'm like, look, this is a guy who under pressure late in the game, you could see he still has that ability to step up. And that instantly made me think, what if we throw this guy in a playoff game? He clearly still has that ability to steal a game. But with how prevalent those injury concerns really showed they were near the end of the year, there's just no way you could have this guy confidently as your one or your two goaltender going into next season. I think it will be Samsonov, Wall, and whether or not he's healthy next year, you either beg someone and give them whatever package they need to take Matt Murray off your hands, or you literally just send him over. There's an island somewhere with Stefan Robidas, so maybe you just throw him over there to do some sightsailing.
Of course. But I mean, Kyle Dubas, again, at the center of these kind of situations where you try to make a gamble with the guy and you have to end up flipping him with your own pick. That's kind of been one of the more Achilles heels of Kyle Dubas, where he's gotten bit more times than not on the gambles that he's took with the goaltending. It's been a really rough patch for him in developing one of them, as well as kind of getting one from himself from a general manager's perspective. But he's going to be the main focus of our conversation now, because they had the exit meetings yesterday, which were very thorough, very long, and they gave a lot of information, clues, but not any valid evidence of what's going to happen. But the biggest one of them all involves Kyle Dubas and what he said about, guess who, the guys who did not show up in the playoffs. Nothing is off the table, as Evan kind of hinted to earlier in the show. It's okay. We have to get into it because it's the biggest part, I think, of this show. Nothing is left off the table. We know Kyle Dubas is very outspoken. He was after that 3-1 or that reverse sweep from the Montreal Canadiens in what was it, 2020? Wow, Jesus, 2021.
2021,
yeah. Jesus, a long time ago, it feels like. But the wounds are still there. But he said after, if you guys remember, and I'm sure you guys do, we were doing the show at that point too, where it was like, this is our core. This is what we're going to do. This is my team. We're going to stick with it. And it's, there was some quote, I can't even remember the exact quote he mentioned, but it had to involve him having a big stick-to-itiveness with this group. He was not going to give anything up. And now it is a complete 180, and it is the complete other way. And rightfully so. The players cannot not show up for this amount of time and expect to be here. I am very happy, as a fan at least, that consequences are happening. I really want to see a big change. I want to see some guys move out, whether that be one or two pieces. We have to see how it works with contracts and who wants to stay. All the guys have said they have sentiments to stay. When you're looking at Matthews, Nylander, Tavares, who has no movement clause, which is going to be a real pain if you want to move it. Obviously,
you
can't.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's a lot of dancing, and it's a lot of things that have to happen. In my opinion, I think there has to be moves, but Kyle Dubas said something big is happening. Jared, I'll throw it to you once more. What is your thought on how you approach this offseason? What is step number one? And I would assume your step number one would involve steps 2, 3, 4, and 5, depending on how the GM situation works. Once you get that sorted out, even ownership for that matter. Shanahan is not innocent in this either. He's been there since earlier than Kyle Dubas. There's a lot more blame that he can go on his part than anything else. So where does your step one to resolve this Toronto Maple Leafs team, and who's in, who's out, and how many is the big question right now?
Well, I'm saying out of the core four, I think one of them's going, and obviously it has to be one of Nylander or Mitch Marner. I think those are the only two out of the core four that I could see a reasonable argument there to move on from. I think Nylander's the easier of the two to trade. I also don't think a Nylander trade changes things as much as a Mitch Marner trade does, just in terms of the contract that you're moving off and the cap space you're moving away from, but also just the fact that if you look at this core, I mean, a big part of the mantra that the Leafs, they're too soft, they don't step up in the playoffs, that isn't really anything that has to do with William Nylander. That is a lot on Mitch Marner. If you totally want to change around this core, I think Marner is the guy you have to try to trade. And there definitely are teams that have the cap space available that would want a Mitch Marner. I mean, not that I think he's going to go to Columbus, but Columbus has very famously been interested in Mitch Marner. They actually tried to offer Cheatham a few years ago before he signed his contract in Toronto. So I think that is the guy that, in my opinion, I'm trying to trade. And you know what? I've been big on this core should come back. I think they're skilled enough, even though they haven't really gotten the job done. And I still stand by, it's not a necessity to totally blow this thing up. But if Dubas isn't making those phone calls, then someone else will. Dubas better be picking up his phone and trying to get a move to come. And I will say, if the moves he's getting offered and the trades he's getting offered for these big guys, for a Mitch Marner, don't put you over the edge as much as you would have liked, I really don't think it's a necessity. But I think if you aren't going to trade one of the big guys, the entirety of the depth of this team has to totally change. I want Marner to go because that's just how you're going to totally shake things up. But even if the core four is back, literally every other part of this roster has to be changed heading into next year. You just can't go in with the same exact core and expect different results. I mean, this team, they showed they were good enough to take out the Lightning. As Evan mentioned, they probably didn't even deserve that series victory. And in Florida, they kind of showed what they're actually made of, which is a team that they have the skill, they have the talent, but they totally will not show up under the bright lights of a deep playoff run. So I think it's definitely Dubas, in my opinion, will stay. I think he is the one that's going to be doing the moving. I think I give him the trust, and I think he's shown an ability year after year to at least change the main mantra of the team. If you remember when he first was brought in, the team were a very soft and speedy team. You look at our team now, we are not that soft and speedy team. In fact, it was almost an overcorrection that we're slow and gritty. I think Dubas is the guy I want to be finding that middle ground, but it is up to Kyle Dubas to do so and make those necessary moves, which as of the locker room cleanout, it definitely sounds like he's willing to do.
Yeah, and I mean, his conversation as well said, if I'm not in Toronto, I'm not anywhere. So that's obviously it's Toronto or nothing. If they're going to offer him anything, it would be, I think, something short term. They're not going to lock him up for a long term unless he gets even more results. And it's just hard to really put it all on Kyle Dubas, just because when you're looking at the deadline, everything that a manager, general manager can like do in his power, like the Ryan O'Reilly one, all good intentions. They worked out well in the regular season, despite him being hurt. Acciari worked out well in the regular season. For the first round of the playoffs, it worked pretty well too. And he just kind of went down the wrong path in the second round. But still, regardless, I thought Ryan O'Reilly was a great addition. You can name a bunch of additions that Kyle Dubas has made, aside from maybe those signed contracts for big bucks, that were great GM moves. So I think that is the one when you look at it, it's going to be hard to get Kyle Dubas out of here. And if it were to happen, there would be very massive changes. There would be maybe two guys off of that core. But Evan, I'm going to go to you now. How do you approach it? Is Kyle Dubas the GM? Is he going to be making the calls? Is it going to be someone in his place? And after, or depending on who the GM is, Kyle or not, what are those changes being made? And is it the core that is going to be tinkered with the most? Is it going to be the depth that's fully slashed in with new people? What's the direction this team goes in? Because clearly they've tried the retooling on the fly, and it clearly hasn't worked either. So they're running out of options, but they got so much to dispose of, which is the route they take.
I don't know. Like, look, my thing with the core four is like you listen to everything and you don't. My whole thing with the Leafs is that they really have nothing left to lose here. Like at some point, you're gonna have to make a trade where you know what you think you might lose it, like a la Florida and Calgary when everyone said that Florida got rinsed in that.
Yeah,
everyone said Florida got rinsed in that deal, and I remember I said like at the beginning of the season, I was like, I don't know, I think Florida might have actually won that trade, and sure enough, they did because Matthew Tkachuk is a Hart finalist right now and didn't even score a goal in the last series, and the Panthers still somehow won. I just think if you're Kyle Dubas, I hope he stays. I think, but the one thing that Jared was saying about, and you were saying about these risky moves is like you're right. I think that's the one detriment is that everyone's going to bring up the Nick Foligno trade with a first round pick. That was horrible. You knew he was an expiring contract. You probably shouldn't have done that. And then you look at the Matt Murray trade, and it was no secret to anyone that Matt Murray has an injury history. That one kind of kills your detriment too. The Ryan O'Reilly trade was a really good trade. So he's had his fair share of really great trades. Going into this offseason, look, I would say, I wouldn't even say Austin Matthews. I think Austin Matthews is still available in a trade. The way he plays, look, I don't know. The way he just got smoked in that fight against Steven Stamkos, I was like, holy smokes. He's soft as warm butter. Him and Marner, just like they are so out of any physicality. I don't know if it's a hot take or not. I personally think Matthews is a little overpaid, just given what he brings to you. He brings you a ton of offense, not a ton of defense, and he's really not going to move any body out in front as a center. But honestly, the one big thing I would do is move John Tavares off. I'd put him on the wing. Like I think John Tavares as a center should just be done. I would bring back Ryan O'Reilly if you could. Move him to center, move Tavares to the wing, and maybe do a Nyes O'Reilly Tavares line to open up next season. In terms of a trade, I think William Nylander has to stay. He's the only one Leaf that has really given you consistent production in the postseason, and he always finds a way to score the goal when you need him to the most. I love Jared's idea though about Mitch Marner going to Columbus. If you're the Leafs, you can get a ton of assets in return for that. Columbus has a ton to offer. I think someone like a Cole Sillinger who hasn't really found his way in Columbus would be a nice return. You get a ton of high first round picks. I don't know if you get the second overall pick in this year's draft, but you would definitely get a lot of valuable first rounders. But I think you need a total revamp here. And when you see a team like Boston that's most likely declining, Bergeron, Krejci most likely gone. I was even thinking in my head, like, why not trade Mitch Marner to Winnipeg and get Connor Hellebuck in return? Like, center a deal around that. Like, I was thinking you could do like Marner and a pick or something and get Hellebuck and Ehlers in return and see what you can float around there. Hellebuck says he doesn't want to do a rebuild in Winnipeg. So I was thinking that could be a potential trade.
Mm-hmm.
You need a Vezina level goaltender. And honestly, the Metro's wide open. Like Vasilevsky came down to earth this season, not just in the playoffs, but this year he wasn't that dominant. So I think it's wide open.
Yeah, and I mean Sheldon Keefe is also a kind of chip in this sort of how this offseason works. I think he's going to be one of the more disposable ones because coaches are in general they're very replaceable. They'll be replaced from their assistants for that sake, and there's just so many out there that you can get, and they all bring different things. That's one thing. If you're looking to maintain or grow a different identity, you get a coach that's tailored to making that identity. And it's a very simple fix. One thing that I personally was looking throughout the playoffs on how the Leafs could potentially model an offseason as, and it would be very drastic, and I don't even know if it's really a gamble because I think it's worked out and it has the high potential to working out. Look at what Seattle did. I mean, you bring in all these players that score, all these players that get jobs done. They're very similar. They're pretty equal. And none of them are star-studded players. And they all chip in different ways, chip away, and you're going to knock the wall down instead of just trying to get different big blasts every now and then. I think that might be something maybe too broad just because you're looking at Seattle expansion team. They had all the players they could pick from. The Leafs have those star players that they kind of have to flip. And I mean, I don't know how they would flip it for those players of similar caliber, but I mean, I think Seattle set a precedent of how to build a playoff team and how to like a different style that you can bring that actually works. They didn't get beaten because they had the lack of stars. They got beaten from a better team called the Dallas Stars. So it's something to consider if the Maple Leafs are going to go that way. I strongly doubt it, but you've seen that it works. And we'll pull in this one one piece that I mentioned, Sheldon Keefe. He is something that he's been here for the last couple of years. You've seen what he can do. He is one of the more winningest coaches in the regular season. So he's got that to his name, but obviously is where the playoff record holds that he does not have a great kind of status quo. So, I mean, what's Keefe looking like? What's his situation? Jared, I'll go to you. Is he on the team with Dubas, without Dubas? He was the only coach Dubas has ever hired. So that's obviously the bond is really stone oven burned in there. But is he gone? Like, what do we make of the coaching situation in Toronto?
Absolutely, he's gone in my opinion. But before I get to Keefe, I just want to say about Kyle Dubas, I'm big on Kyle Dubas should stay. But if Kyle Dubas is going to stay, you have to be willing to get rid of some of your friends.
That's my favorite.
Like Dubas, I think he's a fantastic GM, but part of to his detriment is sometimes he's not that loyalty is a bad thing, but in a business like this, sometimes you need to be able to say, hey, look, Sheldon, I know we've had a lot of good times together, but at some point you got to put your foot down and say, this just isn't working. We need to change behind the bench. And to that point, I want Dubas to stay, but I want Sheldon Keefe far away from this franchise. He's had his good moments with this team. As you mentioned, the winningest coach in Leafs history. That isn't a nothing thing. That's something that is on his resume forever that a team could look at and say, hey, we want this guy to help turn our franchise around. And he's a good coach and he's a nice guy and he's good behind the bench. Not when you're a team that has this high pressure. He's a good, nice guy that's good at motivating a young team that maybe takes you from being a rebuilder to being competitive and getting that race into the playoffs. When you're a consistent playoff team, you just can't have a coach who's like Sheldon Keefe. I'd say every single series that he's been involved in with the Leafs, even including the series where he found victory, I can't recall a series where he's actually been the better of the two coaches. I think he's consistently been outcoached even by John Cooper when John Cooper lost that series against Tampa Bay, consistently makes changes too rapidly, too much in panic. After a loss, He'll switch everything up. You can't have that out of your coach. Your coach needs to have confidence in the team. They need to, throughout 82 game season, that is your trial run to try out different pairings and whatever. You can't be in the playoffs trying out new pairings that you've never tried before. It's just not a strategy that will work ever. And I like Keefe and I appreciate what he's done for this franchise, but at some point, if you're going to make a big change, in my opinion, the easiest way and the best way is to just totally spark a new mindset on that bench, and that comes with the new head coach. Sheldon Keefe is away from this franchise. There's no question in my mind, in my opinion. And even I think he has kind of accepted that. If you saw his tone of voice and whatever during the locker room cleanup, he has kind of, I think, mentally parted ways with this franchise already. He's going to have to say bye to his buddy in the glasses over there because that relationship's done so.
And the language he kind of had after losses where he's like, this is puzzling. I don't know how this happened, all that. You don't want to hear that from your coach. Like if you're going to have a coach out there that's going to lead, he's got to understand why it happened and he's got to understand how to fix it real quick. And Sheldon Keefe, throughout his playoff tenure as a Toronto Maple Leafs head coach, has not been able to do anything near that. Even throughout their first round win, I don't think he made changes that helped them win to an extent. Sure, he went with the 11-7, but I don't think that was the reason why the Toronto Maple Leafs won that game 6 against the Tampa Bay Lightning. But he looks like he's a guy on his way out. He's on his last limbs. And it was a good ride if you look at it for the regular season, but that's not what success is made up off of. It is what you do in the postseason. And the Toronto Maple Leafs have had a big lack thereof in that department. So I guess we're all on the same page here a little bit, where Dubas stays not for long, and he's only staying on the condition of if he makes big time moves. I think we're going to see a mad Kyle Dubas, which we don't really see. Someone who is really, well, now that family is involved, he was very upset that it was a taxing year, he said, on his family because of all the media that Toronto has been putting the pressure on the Toronto Maple Leafs. And his job, obviously, you're the general manager of the biggest hockey market in the entire world. I would imagine it's pretty hard, especially for your family life. So he's going to be probably with Toronto. He's going to be here short term. He's going to need to make some phone calls, regardless of who they are. And some of the core 4, 1 or 2 people, I don't know if it's going to be 3. I personally don't think Matthews should be all that protected. Listen, he's a great player. He's a generational talent, but you can't go a second round without scoring and think you're just going to fly under the radar. He has had his fair share. It's been a couple of years now where just lack of production, just like all the other core players on this team. So there's going to be a shakeup in that department. I'm going to go to one last area that we haven't talked about yet, and is the depth for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Guys are going to be leaving. That is for certain, whether it's to free agency, UFAs, RFAs, perhaps. But guys are going to be out the door. And it's going to be a new depth rotation for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Evan, I'll go to you. What depth players do you see shipping out? Is there anything on the UFA mark, which is extremely weak, by the way, for this upcoming summer, which is also a little weird wrinkle that we have to consider when thinking about this next year's Toronto team. But what depth pieces are going out coming in? And I'm sure Alexander Kerfoot might be at the first peg on that list of who's getting out of here, because he is just, aside from that overtime winner that he had in that spectacular historic Leafs win, it hasn't been really nothing. He's been very dull. So what is the depth going to look like in next year? Because there's a lot of room to shake things up.
Yeah, well, first, I just want to say to Jared's point about Sheldon Keefe, I think a great coaching candidate would be Daryl Sutter, who doesn't give a F about if your name is Austin Matthews.
That'd be interesting.
And he's worked in the Canadian market, so he knows what it's like. He doesn't care if you're Austin Matthews or David Kampf. You're on the same level. Anyway, going back to the depth pieces here, this is the one issue that the Leafs have. They have so many contracts that are so overvalued that they can't sign anyone to they can't sign any solid depth piece to a respectable contract. I just looked at it. TJ Brody's making $5 million for, I think, the next 2 seasons, for next season, and then he's a UFA after that. And then you look at the core 4, who's all making a ridiculous amount of money, except for William Nylander, who's respectably paid. But I don't think you can sign anyone until you trade one of Tavares, Marner, and Matthews. And honestly, the easiest one would probably be to trade Mitch Marner, because you don't have a lot to work with here. I mean, obviously Kerfoot's out the door. O'Reilly I'd bring back. Kampf I'd bring back. I think he's underrated on the penalty kill. Achari, I don't know. There's like a million Noel Acharis. I'd bring back Noel Achari over Sam Lafferty. Oh, wait, Sam Lafferty's staying. Okay, so I'd move Achari because you already have Lafferty. Bunting, I guess you keep. Simmons and Aston Reese are out the door. Who else is gone? Justin Hall, you should have been gone years ago. I'd bring back Luke Shen. Uh, who else? I mean, that's the only UFAs that are left. And then you have Ilya Samsonov, who's an RFA heading into next season. So I don't know. If I'm the Leafs, I saw a lot of people doing this. I saw Adamo posting about it. I try to get Max Domi at whatever cost you can get him at.
I like that.
I think that's a great third line winger to have. Plays with a lot of heart. He'll get you a goal. He'll give you offensive production, and he plays like his dad. Like, he's a feisty guy, and I think that would be a great piece to add. Other than that, I don't know. It's hard with this decor. It's Morgan Riley and a bunch of okay to solid defensemen. Luke Shen was probably the second best defenseman in the playoffs, but other than that, everybody else was terrible. So I don't know what you do with this decor if you're Kyle Dubas. I think it really needs a revamp here. Jake McCabe was not what I think we all expected and hoped him to be. He was really good in Chicago, ironically, but I guess when the light was the brightest, he wasn't good. So yeah,
lots of changes. Definitely.
Main thing, you got to fix the decor, and you can't make a huge line change in Game 5 of an elimination. Like, you just can't.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, anything to add, Jared, on the depth and stuff to kind of look forward to or look into for the offseason on who to take people's spots? There's a couple that you could probably name easily that are not going to be here in Maple Leafs uniform next season. But what is the depth looking like heading into next year? Because that is also, just as much as we blame the core, the depth is also something that steps up when the core isn't. And they didn't really do a great job of doing that, as we saw in round 2.
I think you're going to see some big time depth moves. I mean, we consistently say that with so much money tied into the core four, we've had trouble getting depth, but I actually don't know if that's really been the case. It's a good narrative and the media constantly puts that out there, but I actually think we have done a good job every single season. Dubas seems to find these guys. Calle Jarnkrok came in. He actually became very impactful. We're paying him only $2.2 million. So I think Dubas actually does tend to do a good job of finding guys to come in for cheap. I mean, he found Bunting, who for $900,000 was actually a really good addition. He's not going to be a good addition when he asks for a payday, and especially with how much money he left on the table with his antics this year. I think he's as good as gone from Toronto. But really, I think you're going to be basically all the main UFAs that Evan mentioned. Aside from Acciari, I think Acciari does come back. I actually really liked him. I think he is a really good part of this team, and supposedly a lot of teams are interested in Noel Acciari. So I think you find a way to, I'm not even going to say move heaven and earth, because it's not like going to be that crazy to get Noel Acciari back. But I think you definitely want Noel Acciari staying on your team. But all the other major UFAs and RFAs, you're kind of shipping out of town. Hall's as good as gone. Kerfoot's as good as gone. Bunting's as good as gone. That will free up cap space. And a team I actually think we should be talking about more in terms of the big changes. Obviously, their captain's going to be going most likely. But Boston, I think they have a lot of really interesting UFAs. Garnet Hathaway and Tyler Bertuzzi are both going to be UFAs heading into this season. I think that's a really interesting team to look at in terms of some potential UFAs this year. And I think there are going to be, as I mentioned earlier, Dubas is going to try his best to move on from one of the top guys. But if that proves to be unsuccessful, I still think you're going to see a lot of change coming in the bottom 6. And that will come with going to teams such as Boston that are going to be having, I'm not going to call it a fire sale, because heading into this year, we thought they were going to be garbage and they were the best regular season team in history. But they're still going to have big time changes, especially when they're moving on from their captain and Krejci and whatever. There's going to be some change. There's going to be some people who are kind of on the outside looking in on that black and gold team. And I think that frees up a lot of opportunity to go for Dubas to go check out Boston and potentially grab a Garnet Hathaway or something along those lines. And then as well, as Evan mentioned, there's going to be a lot of changes on defense, but I still think the main core of this defensive core is going to come back. They were, of course, not good enough in the playoffs. They actually proved that they're rather slow. And I do think there's going to be some kind of revamp there, but that will also come with Timothy Liljegren getting 1 year older and getting the trust of, I was about to say Sheldon Keefe, but it won't be Sheldon Keefe. They're getting the trust of whoever new coach is to step into potentially even that position alongside Morgan Riley. He's a young, fast defenseman. I think that will bring you the speed in the defensive core. Then after that, you've a little bit hitched your wagon, in my opinion, to having a more shutdown defensive core of TJ Brody, Jake McCabe, and players along those lines, which honestly, I know obviously our mindsets are going to be made based on how they did in the playoffs when the lights were shining brightest. They didn't step up. But in general, throughout a large sample size, I actually think the Leafs defensive core showed they are really strong. So I do think for the most part, aside from maybe you get one additional defenseman, I think for the most part, the defensive core is going to remain pretty stagnant. And it's going to be a lot of depth moves, a lot of, I won't even say necessarily a lot of just bottom six moves, but I'd say anything from the second line down will see some big time changes. And Boston's a team I'm really interested in to see how they go, because those are two guys. I mean, if we could find a way, it's not likely to get both of them, but both of Garnet Hathaway and Tyler Bertuzzi, like, sign them today and I'm getting a jersey. Like that's some good additions there that make us tough to play, but we also need speed. We showed this year that obviously it's a good thing that we're a harder team to play, but if we can't catch up to teams, like they're able to just blow right by us. Florida did exactly that. So I still think we need to find a way to keep our newfound grittiness, but do a better job of getting speed too, because if we're all defense and all grit and nothing else, that isn't all that great either. We really need to find that middle ground, and I trust Kyle Dubas to do that, but he really needs to prove what he's made of here in finding that middle ground, because if we go totally defense and no offense again, then we could be in some trouble. I mean, there's a lot of guys that I wanted at the deadline that would have brought us more scoring. I mean, Pavel Buchnevich is a big one I really wanted. We obviously didn't do that, but in general, there are a bunch of names like that that would have brought us more scoring, more much needed scoring that probably would have gotten us more than 2 goals in the last 7 games of the playoffs that just didn't come to fruition. There's nothing we could do on that now, but now we have to have all our focuses on the 2024 playoffs, and that comes with getting us to be more physical, but also we have to be a better scoring team, and that includes depth in our scoring, not just Matthews and Marner. If they get shut down, our whole team crumbles like they did this year.
Want anything, Evan?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, the only reason I said no to Nola Chari is because you already have Sam Lafferty. It's just like they're really a carbon copy. I know Achari provides a little bit more, but then if you're also talking about Garnet Hathaway, I just feel like you're getting 3 of the same guys who, it's nice if you get a goal out of them, but you're not really getting them for their scoring abilities. And I just think that's the problem with the Leafs bottom 6 is I thought Yarncrook was a phenomenal signing. I couldn't believe the contract when it happened, but I just feel like a lot of the Leafs bottom 6 is more defensive minded in the aspect of, like, if they get a goal, it's great, but we're not really expecting much offense from them, which is typical of a bottom 6. But when you're trying to build out a championship team, like how we saw Tampa in that dynasty run that they had for those 3 years, like Blake Coleman on their third line was a 20 goal scorer, and he was consistent with that in the playoffs. That's my only thing with the Leafs is Tyler Bertuzzi would be phenomenal if they could get him. He makes 2.6. He's definitely going to want maybe 4.5. So if the Leafs could get him and bring him as a third line winger, I think that's a phenomenal upgrade.
Yep. No, I think I'd be really happy with Tyler Bertuzzi. I mean, I really like what he brought. He's physical. He gets stuff done. He's clutch, and he can score goals, which is always something that is in high demand, especially from a depth piece. And you can move him around. He's very versatile too. Moving up and down that lineup, depending on who he'll be playing with, which is the biggest question of them all this offseason. Who is going to be the guys that they'll be playing with? Because the core is looking like some pieces may be on their way out. Keefe is for sure, and Dubas likely will be sticking around, but he's going to have to make some moves. And I think that's about it, guys. I mean, we've touched upon all the angles of the offseason, the way it can be taken care of, who's going to be in charge of taking care of that, and what happened. The reason why we're talking about this offseason so soon, what happened in the second round against the Panthers. But I mean, that does it for us, I guess. I am your host, Mary Russo. Evan Davis joined me, and Jared Rotenberg signing off. This is probably going to be our last episode for a little bit. I know a lot of us are busy with our own jobs and got our own stuff going on this summer, but more Leafs offseason news for sure, depending on what is happening, and the big ones, because there are going to be some big ones, as we well know. They will be discussed for sure on the show. I can guarantee you that. But that does it for us. Thank you guys for joining. Take care. Have a great rest of your evening, and cheers.